We have exclusive information for you today on the Russia-Ukraine war, information that you probably will not get anywhere else in Western media. Social media, main media, doesn't make any difference. We have some information today that could really change the way people in the West think about the Russia-Ukraine war, and most importantly, it could inform the Trump administration on what is or isn't possible in negotiations to get this war over with. And we have one of our show's favorite guests that we have from Europe, Colonel Jacques Baud, a former Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service official and former NATO officer. Colonel, first of all, just welcome back to the show, and we're really excited about what we're going to share for you today.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this subject. I'm working on a book on that. It will be published later this year, but I'm very happy to talk about this, the result of some research I've done on that matter.
Well, and just I want to get right to it. So first of all, I kind of want to do a little stage setter, and this soundbite by the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, about 12 days ago, kind of epitomizes what Westerners are thinking about this. As Trump's coming in, the viewpoint is kind of, yeah, I know things have been going kind of bad from Ukraine's side, really since 2024, the beginning of that. But still, it's manageable, and here's what we need to keep doing. Here's what his view is.
To prevent war, we need to prepare for it. It's time to shift to a wartime mindset. And this means we need to make our defenses even stronger by spending more on defense, producing more and better defense capabilities. We need to support Ukraine more to change the trajectory of the war. We all want it to end, but above all, we want a peace to last.
Now, inherent in what he's talking about there is the current line of contact, and that's what everybody's focused on in the West right now in terms of negotiated settlement. Will there be a freeze of the war there? Will there be maybe something closer to the June 14 line that Putin keeps talking about, which is the administrative borders of those 4 oblasts, or will it be something different? What nobody seems to be thinking about, it's not even on their radar, is what's going on the Ukraine side of the border inside the rest of Ukraine. Because the idea, at least in the West, is that it's a monolithic society. Everybody's for Kiev, nobody's for Russia. And in fact, there's a lot of Ukraine citizens held captive on the Russian side of the line of contact. But you have some information, Colonel, that suggests that maybe it's not so monolithic after all, and there could be sort of a fifth column threat to the Kiev regime.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we tend to focus on military operation, obviously, which is definitely an important aspect of the war. We talk a lot about the international context and relation between Russia and the West and all that. But as you just said, we tend to forget what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, on the Ukrainian side of the Ukrainian theater of war. And the recent development we have seen since about, the last 6 months, 8 months or so, tends to show that probably we should pay more attention to what's going on. And so far, as you said, we were under the narrative that Ukraine is 100% behind Zelensky, and that, in fact, even in Russian-occupied territory, the population is resisting a Russian presence and all that. And that's not exactly the picture we have when we study the matter. And I just want to go probably a little bit back in history, just prior to Maidan, just to explain a little bit the context and to see how things have evolved today and what may become, I would even call it a game changer, not so much in strategic terms, in strategic in the military balance, if you want, but in the sense that the Ukrainian leadership now might not just be threatened by the Russians, but also by its own population. And that's exactly what I just want to discuss today. So if we can go back a little bit in history, you may remember, some have seen these kind of maps, where you saw this is the map of the result of the presidential election in 2010. And you could see that we have a very clear divide here between the ethnic Russians in Ukraine, who in fact voted massively for President Yanukovych, and the rest of the north and west of the country who voted for Mrs. Tymoshenko at that time. Just to note, just to open a bracket, the OSCE considered these presidential election as honest and fair. So there was nothing wrong in these elections. But it's interesting to understand that because just after the coup in Maidan, you remember that President Yanukovych was toppled on the 23rd of February 2014. And on that day, the very first decision of the new unelected authorities of Ukraine was to make the Russian language no longer an official language. It was just a language of Ukraine, but not an official one as it used to be since 2012. And that triggered mass protests in the whole southern part of Ukraine. And here you have this chart. I don't want to go into all the details, but you could see that exactly the same regions that who voted for Yanukovych, in fact, just started protests in this region. And the figures here don't indicate the number of protests, but the number of locations. So you can imagine, you could see that obviously in the Donbass region, the opposition was very strong. It was a little bit less strong in Odessa, in Crimea, and well, in Crimea, it's a little bit different because Crimea was in the process of making its. In fact, Crimea was in this process of independence somehow, and that's probably a different process. But for the rest, we see that we had this mass protest, and the interesting thing here is that it was not simply, let's say, a mass movement like a protest you could have in France with the yellow vest and things like this. It was something much deeper, because when you had the presidential elections in 2014 to elect President Poroshenko, out of that was the result of in fact, the first presidential election after Maidan. You could see that the number of invalid votes, again, the number was massive in the whole southern part of Ukraine. Crimea is no longer here counted because in the meantime, the Crimea became independent and had a referendum to join the Russian Federation. Just as a reminder, before Ukraine had been independent, that means in December 1991. Before that, in January of that year, the Crimea had a first referendum in which the population asked to be detached from Ukraine and be under the authority of Moscow directly. And in January 1991, Crimea became the Autonomous Socialist Republic of Crimea. And that was just before Ukraine became independent. Once Ukraine became independent, it refused that result, and that led to the tensions about Crimea. But that explains why in 2014, Crimeans regained the independence they voted for in 1991. But,
and if I could just ask real quick before you leave that chart there, what is the definition in this case of invalid votes?
Well, these are the votes that, in fact, are for some reason that people just didn't. Because when you have a presidential election, you have to choose between two persons. And probably in those invalid votes, instead of choosing between the two that were to be chosen from, they added a third name, probably, or something like that. Or they just erased one, or there are things like this. So it just means that the votes that people didn't accept the selection they were proposed to vote for.
And so it was the authorities in Kiev which made the determination that they were, quote, invalid. Is that
exactly
accurate?
Well, no, I mean, even in Switzerland, for instance, we have a lot of referendum, as you know. But if you are proposed two names, let's say, for a vote, an election, and you decide to add a third one, then your cast is invalid. It is invalid because you're not supposed to add your name or whatever name. You are supposed to choose between the two which are proposed.
And do you know what led to such widespread voters selecting things that they knew would be technically invalid to put that on there anyway? Do you know why they did that?
Because they wanted to show that they opposed the election of Poroshenko, and they didn't want to have Poroshenko. So probably even they just strike through the name of Poroshenko, or they added another name like Yanukovych or whatever, which was definitely not running for the presidential election. But that's you can say objectively that is invalid because and you see that in also in France, for instance, or in other countries, when you oppose the selection that is proposed for you, you just add a new name, or you just strike through all the names that are proposed, and that's an invalid vote. So it's not much. It's a way of protesting. It's probably the same in the US for the presidential election, I assume. I don't know, but I assume so. So, but the interesting thing here is that you definitely have, again, a clear divide between the south and the eastern part of the country, as opposed to the central and northern part of the country. And what happened next is even more interesting because I was in Ukraine at that time, and we saw that this protest against the Kiev authorities morphed into a widespread, I would say, rebellion, I could say. And in each oblast or region of the south, they created some kind of popular republic, and you had even some forces. I will come to this later. And they created, in fact, a very temporary, that lasts just a few weeks, but I was there. I was at the Odessa Naval Academy at that time. I remember it was extremely tense because everybody expected this movement to affect, to have implication, strong security implication in Odessa itself. But in any case, that was this flag, which is very similar to the I think Confederate flag of the U.S. Was the United Forces of Novorossiya, and these forces were quite extensive. And when you look, I don't want to go into all the details, but they were composed of the forces of the Donbass People's Militia. It was not yet about Donetsk or Lugansk. It was just Donbass Militia, and you had the forces of the Southeast Joint Armies. And this was not a big thing, but you still had commando units, special forces, and things like this. And in addition to these forces that were in the southern part of the country, you had volunteers. And those volunteers, interestingly enough, they came from those minorities that you have in Ukraine, in other parts of Ukraine. You had, for instance, the St. Stephen Legion from Hungary. You have the Aliyah Battalion with Jews. You had this detachment coming from Serbia, and you had also this battalion from Ruthenia, which is the extreme western part of Ukraine. So it was not simply the Russian part of Ukraine, and that was a massive movement. It was repressed. It was very brutally repressed. And in fact, this repression led to the involvement of what we call neo-Nazi, ultranationalists, or there are different names to describe these units. But that's the reason why the Kiev authorities had to create those units, because the Ukrainian army that in fact was involved or committed to repress this uprising, the Ukrainian army was also composed by Russian speaking and others, Russian speakers and others. So they defected to the rebels. And that's very much, if you go to some, for instance, the special battalion Kalmius, which started as a company, it became very quickly an artillery regiment. And why that? Because the personnel of this battalion was in fact personnel from a Ukrainian artillery unit that simply defected to the rebels.
And so, if you could run back to that previous map you showed with all the red and that one right there. So now maybe you're going to get to there in a minute, so I may be preempting you, but that I guess represented where the rebellion started shortly after Maidan. But then by the time of the Russia-Ukraine war, there was only the Luhansk and Donetsk were really still in what I guess would be red on this map here. What happened to all of those forces after 2014 and before 2022?
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to come to, because in fact, with the very brutal repression that happened, at the end, what remained was just the two the forces of Lugansk and Donetsk. And if you remember what happened on the very first phase of the Russian attack on February 2022, we say the Russians attacked Ukraine. And in essence, this is true, this is that. But if we have a more military look at what really happened, it was in fact a coalition. And it was a coalition of three armies. You had the Russians coming from Crimea and coming from from Belarus and from the northern part of Ukraine, the area of Kursk, basically. But in the Donbass area, the first line was composed by the armored forces of the Donetsk Republic and the armored forces of the Lugansk Republic. And those forces were not equipped and not even trained like the Russian ones. And that explains also why these were the remnants, in fact, of what you had with the Novorossiya in 2014. There was the leftover of the repression that happened between 2014 and 2022. But these armies were just popular armies, like militias, if you want. So they were not trained to the standard of the Russian army. And that's the reason why in the very first phase of the Russian special military operation, you had so many casualties especially in the Donbass area, because in addition to that, the Donbass was exactly where the bulk of the Ukrainian forces were waiting or preparing, in fact, for an offensive against the Donbass. And this is still the area where the Russians are still fighting today. Now, since September 2022, the Russians have merged these units into the Russian army. In terms of command, what you had at the very beginning of in February, you had a coordination, as you have in a coalition, in fact. You had a coordination between those three forces. And from September 22 onwards, then you had a unified command for all that. That's where General Surovikin came in the game and became the overall commander for all the forces in Ukraine. But before that, they were under separate command. And that's also why from October 2022, you had this improvement in the operations conducted by the Russians, because from that point, they had the full control over what was going on in the Donbass area. But the point here is just to say that those militias or armies of Lugansk and Donetsk were in fact as I said, the leftovers of the United Forces of Novorossiya of 2014. And that's important, because what we have seen since February 2014 is that you have, of course, you have these the forces that are fighting, but and as we said, in this area, a lot of those pro-Russian, if you want, were suppressed and brutally repressed, but they are still there. And that explains why in March 2022, the SBU, the security forces, started to eliminate all the guys who were suspected to be like partisans of Russia. And that happened with Denis Kireyev, who used to be a member of the military intelligence service, but he was killed by the SBU, which is the security service. Kireyev was one of the Ukrainian negotiators in Gomel in February, beginning of March 2022. In fact, he was killed on the 2nd of March. So in the very beginning of the negotiations. And in these same months, you had, even here, I have the movie, but I think I don't want to show it because probably it would be erased by YouTube. But that's the execution of Dmitry Demyanenko, who was even the deputy chief of the main directors of SBU for Kiev. And he was killed by other SBU members on the 10th of March 2022. So it was very much an elimination of everyone who was suspected to be pro-Russian. Meaning, what I mean with that, and the interesting thing about that, is that despite what happened between 2014 and 2022, you still have a lot of people who are still partisans of the Russians within Ukraine itself. And when I say Ukraine, it is in the western part of Ukraine. So when we talk about partisan warfare, of course, we can talk about the partisan warfare can be on both sides, because the Western narrative was that the Ukrainians would resist and would definitely not accept the Russian presence and all that. So here it's interesting to have a look at a survey that has been done by the Kiev Institute of Sociology. And in fact, there are two surveys. One was made in December 2021, and the other was done at the beginning of February 2022, just before Russian intervention. And you see the willingness of individuals to resist with weapons against the Russians. So without surprise, you can see that in the west and the center of the country, you have the highest percentage of individuals who are ready to take arms against the Russians. By the way, here it's just the armored resistance. Of course, I didn't put here the figures for the non-violent resistance, like civil resistance. This was much higher. But when we talk about armed resistance, these were the figures. And you can see that in the south and in the east, and even in February 2022, by the way, in the east, this survey was conducted outside of the two Republic of Donbass, the Lugansk and Donetsk. So it was in the remainder of the oblast. And you see that even...
And correct me if I'm wrong, but that the rest of that oblast, that's where Kharkiv city is. Is that correct?
No, Kharkiv is a little bit higher.
A little bit further up. Okay.
Higher. Would be here in that area here. So Kharkiv is not part of the Donbass. It's important to say. So you see that the lowest number of people who are ready to oppose the Russians. And in fact, when you see what happened after the Russian intervention, you had here, this is the Novorossiya, if you want, here, and here this is the territory which is currently occupied by Russia, if you want. And that gives you an indication of the level of resistance that the Russians may find in this area. It's close to zero. And in fact, what you had at the very beginning of the Russian intervention, you had a few armed groups that emerged, like the Berdyansk Resistance Army, that's in Berdyansk. Berdyansk is on the coast, is somewhere here along the Azov Sea. But that they were active for a few months, and now I think they've totally disappeared. And that you have a few others that also emerge, because obviously you also have hardline Ukrainian in this area, especially in Mariupol. You remember that Mariupol was one of the strong points of the Azov regiment. So you still have or had a lot of ultranationalists in this area. But as of today, we can say that this has more or less disappeared. And that's about the resistance in the Russian occupied part of Ukraine. What happens in the Ukrainian part of Ukraine, which is not occupied by Russia, Russia started very, very quickly in the mid-2022 to disseminate some guidance to the population of Ukraine for like a civil society resistance, non-violent resistance. And you had this guide this is the document, this is a 14-page document that was disseminated. I don't know exactly how they did that, probably through internet and things like this. That gives advice for the Ukrainians who support Russia when they work in administration, in the military, in police, in other institutions, in order to make some kind of a non-violent sabotage. And even in this document, by the way, it's even suggested that those who are not trained in using weapons should not fight with weapons. They should only use like civil disobedience and things like this. And this was even advertised that was even advertised, not advertised, but it was reported on the website of the Ukrainian military intelligence. They reported and they made some comments about this book. But this booklet is interesting because it shows that the Russians didn't start right away with developing some kind of armed resistance in Ukraine, but started to mobilize the population in a kind of civil disobedience movement. And that apparently worked quite well. But beside this, and I would say since 2023, it started already in 2022, but that was very much apparent in 2023, you had armored resistance that appeared. One of the most famous one is Ruski Kherson, Russian Kherson, which is located, I will show the map later, which is located in, not only in Kherson, but started in Kherson area. In the Kherson region, which is not occupied by Russia. Apparently, before leaving in October 2022, the Russian special forces trained those guys for guerrilla warfare and things like this. But the Ruski Kherson as a resistance movement appeared in July 2023 officially. It's interesting also just to note here that the symbolic used they're not communist movement, despite the symbolic that may remind us what we see in the 70s also with the Red Brigades and things like this. This is not a communist movement. This is a movement that's based, and the symbolic it reminds people about the partisan warfare that you had in Ukraine during World War II. And that's not a coincidence if this guy is addressing a message here. With as background, you have the so-called victory banner of the Red Army. This is the banner that was put on the Reichstag, so the German parliament, in May 1945. And this has remained a symbolic flag of the victory for Russia. And so
I'm sorry, I'm running a little bit short on time, so I don't want to rush you too much. Sorry. But so you mentioned that they started sometime in 2022, were mostly civil disobedience, et cetera, but then they started moving more towards potential. Well, and you're talking there maybe in late 2022, the Russians started actually training partisan leaders, one would presume. But apparently that has changed, because I think the last time you were on, just after we went off the air, you talked about how there had been a simultaneous raid of about 1,000 different spots throughout Ukraine occupied territory.
Exactly.
And I wonder if you could talk about that transition.
Exactly. And to understand that, we probably have to go to this map. Here are the map of the best known movements that are currently active. And you see this is Novorossiya here in this part. And these are the movements that are currently active in these areas, even beyond these areas. You have the movement Dozor in Odessa, Kherson, this is the Ruski Kherson we have mentioned. You have Nikolaev underground and Kharkov, the Kharkov Partisans. And the interesting thing here is that the Nikolaev underground and Ruski Kherson are definitely ethnic Russians, if you want, or the major part of the bulk of the fighters are probably Russians. But in Dozor here, this is a Ukrainian movement. And that's where it comes to be interesting, because in Ukraine, currently, in the western part of Ukraine, you have not just pro-Russian guerrilla or insurgency that developed, but also Ukrainian. It started with those who reacted against forced recruitment. And they started to burn the vehicles of the recruiters and things like this, to attack recruitment stations and things like this. And now, and that's the interesting development, and that now they work together with the pro-Russian movement. And I mentioned here, this is the, you had on last Friday, you had an attack on a railroad in the eastern part of Ukraine. And the interesting thing is that was on the 24th of January, but it's not an isolated movement. It was also before in the same months. The interesting thing is that it happened in this area here. So in the far west part of the country. And this was performed by Ukrainian movement, not Russian movement. Meaning that you have in the Novorossiya area, you have obviously those who develop kind of guerrilla activities. By the way, the Nikolaev Underground was the movement that informed Russia in August last year as Ukraine started its operation against Kursk. And you may remember, I think I mentioned that on your channel at that time, but I don't remember. But anyway, in any case, before the Ukrainians started their offensive against Kursk, the Russians managed to put the Akhmat battalion, the Chechen battalion, and a unit of special forces in the area of the nuclear power plant of Kursk. And they could do that in advance because they have been informed by precisely the Nikolaev Underground. Meaning that all these movements now here in this part of Ukraine and probably in this, obviously in the other part, they are performing not simply information and kind of intelligence information for the Russians, but they also performed activities like sabotage activities, and that's exactly what you have, what you had in Rovno in early this month. That was the sabotage for convoys, railway convoys that was bringing weapons to the eastern part of the country. So they are doing exactly the same kind of task that the Special Operation Executive did just in support of the D-Day in 1944. And that explains why you have in the recent weeks a lot of crackdown on arms cache, on the people who have been fired from position, military leaders, and some politicians also. We remember it's obviously also because of corruption, but also because that these people probably diverted weapons towards the resistance. And
Colonel, I wonder if I could ask you. You mentioned
Sure.
that Odessa area there. I can't remember which month it was. It was 2014. Part of this uprising, when you were on one of your earlier maps, you were talking that there was a big issue in Odessa, and I wonder if you can talk about the impact this has, maybe even psychologically, on the any of the resistance down there, because there was a lot of concern because there was a lot of pro-Russian protesters at the time that were forced into a building in Odessa. Then it was set on fire and they were not allowed to leave, and many of them burned to death. And I know it's been a very painful issue for many in Russia to this day. To what extent does that affect any of the potential uprisings in Odessa?
Well, that in fact was part of the brutal repression that happened in 2014 up to 2022. And again, what happened at the trade union building, that's exactly what you just mentioned in Odessa, that was performed by those paramilitary forces. And you had similar massacres in Mariupol and all that. We talk about the Azov battalion, but in fact, you had about 20, 30 different paramilitary groups that were coming from the western part of the country, ultranationalists, very brutal individuals. And that's also something that, in fact, prompted the Crimeans, and not just the Crimeans, because when I talked about Crimea, in fact, this repression that you had in 2014 extended to Crimea. And when we talk about the Russian intervention in Crimea, I was in NATO at that time. I was monitoring the region, and I can tell you there was no additional Russian troops brought into Crimea. There was no landing of troops, nothing. You had, as per the status of force agreement between Russia and Ukraine, you had 22,000 Russian soldiers stationed and based in the peninsula. And you had no additional troops from that point. But we have, according to the status of force agreement, these forces, in case of crisis, were allowed to protect their base and to get out of their base in order to make like a protection perimeter around the base. They were allowed to secure the airports and the logistical installations in order to allow a supply and logistical support from Russia. And they were also allowed to maintain law and order in case of disturbance. And that's exactly what happened when the paramilitary forces arrived in Crimea and started to shoot at the Crimeans. That's where Vladimir Putin, and he said that himself, he authorized the soldiers garrisoned in Crimea to intervene or to get between those the parties in order to bring back calm and order.
That's
where, but you had
and so John, I'm sorry, we're literally just about out of time here. So I wonder if you can kind of bring us to the front. What is possible from these partisan warriors right now, or these fighters, whatever, however you want to call them? Because there is some reports in the last 2 weeks I've specifically seen from the Ukraine intelligence side claiming that there is a buildup of potentially 150,000 or so Russians on the other side of Pokrovsk, meaning that they, implying anyway, that they could launch some kind of an operation in a bigger way than what they have been doing. In the event that happened, what is the risk of uprisings in Odessa, in Kharkiv, and any of these other areas you're showing that could potentially even more weaken the Ukrainian lines?
Well, I think, what happened, especially with the Kursk operation, the Ukrainians had to take troops from other parts of Ukraine, in particular from Odessa. And that means that these areas are, in fact, weakened by the fact that Ukraine needs troops on the east. So that's the first thing. So meaning that even if those resistance forces, I'm not sure that the Russians are really counting with these partisans and all that to achieve victory. But I think that those groups, at this stage, this may change in the future, but at this stage, I think the problem is that these insurgent or rebels or partisans, as you want, underground, as the Russians call them, in fact, are a threat to the regime, to the political stability of the western part of Ukraine.
Oh, wow.
And that's I think, what is the concern of the Ukrainian leadership at this stage, because this could completely destabilize. When we see the polls, I can probably go to some, I don't want to go into all the details, but if we look at the trust that Volodymyr Zelensky is enjoying, we see that it's the trust for Zelensky is eroding very, very quickly. And today,
and that's all of Ukraine right there.
Yeah, that's the all of Ukraine. I mean, what is under Ukrainian control.
Got it.
So meaning that this means that the trust in the leadership, the Ukrainian leadership, is eroding, and that may develop into something because a lot of people also you have a fatigue in the Ukrainians, which is also because these are figures by the Kiev Institute of sociology, by the way. But here you see, for instance, another figure, which is other figures that are interesting, because it shows that you have less and less Ukrainians who are ready to endure the war. And if we look at the proposals, you have more and more Ukrainians that would accept the idea of giving up territory in exchange of peace. So meaning that the what's happening in the Ukrainian society is quickly changing. And the resistance movements we have today may just be kind of a catalyzer, I don't know exactly the word in English, but may help to catalyze a change, substantial change in the Ukrainian leadership. And
so what is the risk right now of a new 2014 style Maidan or political uprising in the western part of Ukraine?
Well, I think it's hard to tell because we only have very limited information about the real capabilities of these groups, and a lot of those groups, they are probably, I mentioned just 4 here on the on my presentation, but in fact there are probably more than 10 or 10 or 15 armored groups that are active in Eastern Ukraine, but we don't really know them because obviously they don't make much advertising. The SBU is hunting them all over Ukraine, meaning that we don't know exactly what the real capabilities are. But I would suggest that their importance will grow in the next month because the fatigue of the population is increasing. There are talks about peace, more kind of options are on the table, at least from probably on the Ukrainian population, because there's a lot of Ukrainians that think that it will be a good idea to trade territory against peace, and that this is a mix that may evolve in something. I mean, probably not even an armored uprising in the sense of a revolution or a violent, but probably something that may force the current leadership of Kiev to step down to organize some kind of election or something.
Do you think that, last question that I have here, a couple of days ago, you have General Budanov from the Ukraine side warned pretty starkly. They said if we didn't get continued support to whatever level he decides from the United States, he said within 6 months, the Ukraine could literally cease to exist as a state. Do you think that he had some of these things in mind?
Well, that's interesting because later this declaration of Budanov was denied on the website of the military intelligence. They just after he said that, they denied it. So I don't know what's the reality. My view is that it may be a possibility that it was what Budanov said, because I think he should have a better understanding of the current situation within Ukraine as we do. And probably he was factoring in the issue of what's happening now in the Ukrainian society, including those partisan movements. Because my view is that now they are putting troops, they are putting everything they have towards the east, meaning that they have less and less capabilities to fight against those resistance. And that's, I mean, again, I don't know if what Budanov said was correct or right or properly reported, but right. In my view, this is a plausible.
So before I let you go, how does this impact Trump's ability to negotiate something? Because I think a lot of people, at least they're talking in Washington, that this could take, not just 100 days, but could take maybe 6 months. But the question is, Can the Ukraine side maintain, with whatever's going on partisan-wise behind the lines and on the front lines of the military, can they survive another 6 months?
Well, that's a good question. Again, things are developing very quickly in the west of Ukraine, within the Ukrainian population. So it's very hard to assess how long this will last. But the thing is that nobody in the West is taking into account these changes and this the emergence of partisan warfare in the West. We assume that this would happen in the Russian zone, but not in the Ukrainian zone. By the way, in the Russian zone, everything we have seen, like a bomb attack and things like this, that was not performed by popular resistance. That was performed by special forces, including what we had in Russia itself, attack with drones in Moscow and things like this. This was done by special units of the SBU, but not by popular resistance. While what we have now in Ukraine, in the western part of Ukraine, is our popular movements, and not just pro-Russian popular movements, but also Ukrainians' popular movement who come in support to Russia. And that's the interesting aspect. And that's exactly the interesting thing that we have seen in Rovno. These are Ukrainians, not Russians, meaning that there is a very strong movement of rebellion that is all across Ukraine, regardless of their ethnicity. And that's
that's the big alarm, because I think as the more as the war fatigue just affects the entire population, and as they see Ukraine continuing to lose on the line of contact, and they see America saying, we're not going to give you any more stuff and we're just negotiating the end, you can see where the risk is going to continue to grow for the Ukraine side. Well, listen, we really appreciate you coming on today. This has been just amazing stuff, not necessarily good stuff, I guess, especially from the Ukraine side, but something that everybody in the West, especially in Washington, D.C., needs to understand heading into these negotiations, because time is probably not on Kiev's side.
Absolutely. Fully agree with that.
Well, listen, thank you very much for coming on. We really do appreciate it. Appreciate you guys watching us too. Be sure and spread this around, because not a lot of people know all the things that Colonel Baud just showed to us. Just in about less than 10 minutes now, we have Colonel Doug Macgregor is going to talk about specifically the negotiating position for the two sides here, and find out how limited are Trump's options really. And based on what we've just talked about here, they're probably more weak than even the Trump people may have thought. But you're not going to want to miss that. Tune in for Colonel Doug Macgregor just about 8 minutes from now. Thank you very much. We'll see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.